Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful week, wonderful Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, October 7th, and I am very excited for today's show. I'm even more excited than last time because this episode is only horror movies. So I'm still doing a new movie, obviously, but it just so happens to be a horror movie this week. And the theme is a little bit loose. It's kind of based around endings. I want to do an episode that's kind of around like twisty endings. I don't want to say outright twists because they're not all that way, but definitely have a little bit of a surprise or shocking ending. So the first one is a brand new movie called Antebellum on Amazon Prime. Then my weekly watch this week was a highly anticipated movie for me called Signs, an M. Night Shyamalan movie from the early 2000s. And then my weekly recommendation is one of, if not what I think, the most underrated horror movie in recent years, and that is The Others. I use recent loosely. It's like almost 20 years old at this point, but I'm a big fan of that movie, and I can't wait to recommend it. And finally, the last segment of the episode, I figured I'd keep with this trend, and I'd do my top 5 movie endings of all time. And it's mostly like last shot, last scene as far as movie endings go. More or less last shot, actually. So that's kind of what I want to go off of. But that is today's episode. Hope that you are all excited, and let's get started. All right, so the first movie that I want to talk about today is called Antebellum. This is a movie that I had been anticipating for a little while. I remember watching the trailers back when they came out, when it was anticipated that it was going to come out in theaters, which I was very excited about. And I think it was around this time that it was going to come out anyway, but it ended up releasing on Amazon Prime. And for a movie like this, sometimes watching a scary movie in your house can be just as horrifying, if not more horrifying, so I was still fairly interested, and the synopsis from Lionsgate goes as such. Successful author Veronica Henley finds herself trapped in a horrifying reality and must uncover the mind-bending mystery before it's too late. So, that's a pretty vague premise, and I'm going to say, honestly, across the board for this episode, it is going to be a pretty spoiler-heavy episode, because all of these movies, you kind of have to relate them to the ending to really talk about them in depth. So if you have any desire to watch any movie and you haven't seen them before, Antebellum, Signs, and The Others, which if you haven't heard of The Others, I highly recommend you at least skip that segment because I think you should go into that movie pretty blind. But if you have any desire to see those movies, I would recommend just skipping through this episode or going on to a previous episode, a future episode, because I'm going to be talking about spoilers in this episode pretty heavily. So, to talk about Antebellum, I would say that there are some pretty heavy spoilers to talk about, but a lot of them were spoiled in the trailer, is kind of the problem. So, again, very vague premise, but that's not what it seemed like the movie was about. At least, so the trailer seemed somewhat vague, but it used a lot of pretty evocative imagery to still be intriguing, to get people interested. And so, like, it seems like you don't know what's going on from the trailer, but then when you go into the movie, you're like, oh, okay, I got it. I have seen all these images from the trailer. I know exactly what's going to happen, and so it's fairly predictable. I think it would have been predictable even if that hadn't been the case, and it makes for a pretty compelling trailer, but does not work for the movie. So the beginning of the movie is basically Janelle Monáe is kind of the main character. Veronica, that's what they said her name was. I forget. It's not all that memorable. So Veronica is on a slave plantation. She is a slave in these opening few scenes. And that's kind of the first chunk of the movie. Then the second chunk is her in modern day, and you're not really sure you're not supposed to be sure whether or not this was a dream or a relative or something like that. And then turns out in the final act that she was kidnapped, and it's a modern day slave plantation, and it's sort of like a weird sci-fi captive kind of premise. And so it's obviously very horrifying. But I have to say that I was not a big fan of this movie. I don't think it delivered on its premise. I think the premise is a lot more fascinating, a lot more intriguing than the movie ended up being. I also think that the trailer set this up as a potential time-related movie. Like, it's like the past and the present are kind of folding in on themselves, which would have been significantly more interesting. I don't know how you would have done that, because I didn't really, think about it all that much. I was hoping the movie would do that for me. But alas, it ended up being this, which is still fine, but I don't think it served for the time it was. I think it's a 2-hour movie. I don't think it was worth all that time. I also think the movie itself is very boring. So let's just get into all of the nitty-gritty of it all. So as far as the acting goes, Janelle Monáe is fantastic. I'm a big fan of Janelle Monáe, both her acting and her music. I think she is an insanely talented person all around. And I'm really happy about all the success that she has. And really, she knocks it out of the park in this role. I would say she's not given all that much. I think she's given just as much as certain actors in even, really good movies, or, side characters in good movies. So she might not be given as much for, a main role, but she still is given a fair amount to work with. And she really does the best she can. One of her first scenes is a scene that's very dramatic, very intense, and really very difficult to watch. But part of the reason it's so difficult to watch is because her performance is so emotionally heavy and rich. So I think that she really delivers in both the modern day context, where she's supposed to be sort of this suit and tie businesswoman, but also a loving, caring mother. And then also when she's at sort of her wit's end and really at her lowest low when she's in this modern day plantation. And so I think both are equally as good and equally as dynamic, which I'm happy to see, because I think in a movie that goes so drastically back and forth, it might be reasonable that the main actor is better at one or the other. But I have to say, I believed her in both segments of the film, and so in that sense, I think she really delivers a great performance. Everybody else, however, not bad by any means. A lot of this, I think, has to do with the writing, but they're fairly archetypical. All of the villains are villainous, and that's it. They're not really given a reason for all of this other than racism, which, fair enough, but even still, there's just no nuance behind the villains, which doesn't make for a very interesting back and forth, and that might not be the point, because you do really get some catharsis when the villains get their comeuppance, because it's always nice to see racists go through that, but even still, the characters themselves are not all that interesting to watch on screen, because they're so sort of wink wink nudge nudge evil. I also think that all of the other I say bit characters just because they're not in the movie all that much, but there are some really phenomenal actors in this. I'm a big fan of Kiersey Clemons. She's in this movie for 10 minutes max, 15 minutes max, and she really doesn't really drive the plot forward other than these people are evil, which we've already garnered from the situation that they're being put in. So I thought that was a little unnecessary. Would have been more interested if she was around more, because I'm just a big fan of her. I also am a big fan of Gabourey Sidibe. I had seen her in American Horror Story. She's been in a lot of really great things. I think she's a very talented, excellent actress. But in this, she's kind of boiled down to a stereotype, and I just think that she's overall a little bit annoying. And I think everybody other than Janelle Monáe in this movie only serves one purpose. They're not a character that is flexible in any way, and so in that sense, a lot of the performances just seem a little, just for lack of a better word, kind of annoying, because they feel so either unnecessary or just so flat and two-dimensional that they're all kind of boiled down to stereotypes or archetypes, which for a movie like this feels somewhat inappropriate even, and just poor screenwriting. And so now, because of which, we can go into the screenwriting. Oh, and I want to say, because none of that is the actor's fault. A lot of these actors are really great, and I think they have a really great performance. Or, that's a lie. I'm sorry. I think they're doing the best that they can with what they're given. So, what are they given? They're given a pretty boring screenplay, and I can't stress this enough. This is marketed, and a lot of times horror movies suffer from this, because a lot of horror movies are not these fast-paced jump scares, action, intense horror movies. That's a pretty small sliver of the genre, but almost all of them are marketed as such because that's what's going to get people in the seats. And so for this movie, it's really marketed as a racially charged, intense horror movie along the lines of Us or Get Out. It is produced by Jordan Peele. It's produced by some of the producers of Get Out and Us. I don't know if Jordan Peele actually produced this one. But the movie really is not that. It's a pretty slow burn horror. I would say even horror inspired. It's not really horror. The horror element, see, here's the thing. Maybe this is somewhat controversial, but I think it's just as much a horror movie as something like 12 Years a Slave is, because it's really just evoking this tragic, horrific time in America's past that's really just as horrific to watch in any context. It's not more horrific to watch it modern day. That's not what makes it a horror movie. What makes it a horror movie is the situation that people were put in for these scenarios. And so watching this movie and saying that it's a horror movie and saying that something like 12 Years a Slave or even like Roots is a drama, I feel like is disingenuous. I would say that Antebellum is just as much a drama. I would probably just say it's a drama. There's like one or two jump scares, but that can even happen in a drama. You can have intense moments where you kind of startle the audience. In fact, I think that works really, really well in a lot of dramas. And so I really think marketing this as a horror movie was a bad idea, or even just like depicting this as a horror movie. If you're gonna make it a horror movie, make the villains more dynamic, add in some more of the jump scares, which I honestly, the jump scares, I'm not always that big a fan of, but the movie itself is horrific. That doesn't mean that it's a horror movie. And it's just slow, and horror movies are supposed to be a fun communal experience where you're all kind of like on the edge of your seat, and that's why you're watching them. Even when I watched VHS, a movie that I wasn't a huge fan of, but I still believed had some merit to it, I was still cringing and guessing along with my friends. For this one, we all just kind of sat in silence because nothing really went on. First of all, the first act is just really difficult to watch. It's a lot of just like inflicting pain on people, which in some contexts of horror movies can work, but in this one is just like really icky and you feel gross after watching it. And then the second act is even more boring because it just takes place in modern day and we're following this character that we really realistically have learned nothing about from the first act because they're trying to hide this weird plot twist that isn't really a twist because it's pretty darn predictable. And so it's just this person going about her daily life with a little bit of a creep factor going on, and then we're suddenly thrust into the third act, which is supposed to be this huge climax, but really doesn't have anything interesting other than giving some of these characters what they deserve, which I will admit is pretty cathartic. The third act is obviously the best part of this movie because something actually happens, but in the first two acts, there's really nothing because it's trying to hide this big reveal. And in that sense, the end of the movie feels a little bit anticlimactic. It's supposed to be this big, heroic moment that doesn't really work. Also, side note, I don't know if this is the audience for this, but it just reminded me of this Eric Andre skit where he and his friends dress up as slaves and go to a Civil War reenactment camp and just run around because they're not supposed to be there. And I think that honestly had just as much of a social commentary impact on me than this did, and it was entertaining and silly, and I don't know. I just thought that like it reminded me of a stupid Eric Andre sketch, which is not what should be happening in a horror movie. And there's this big triumphant ending that I just really don't feel like the movie deserved. And after the movie, just feel kind of gross and icky, and it was just slow, and it felt too long. And yeah, that's the screenplay. And I think I can kind of like slow it down for these next few things, just kind of mention small things. The production design is obviously, I don't know, I think it's pretty good. It's subtle in the way that it hints at the fact that this is actually real, like modern day, even though some of the reveals happen inorganically because of the fact they're trying to hide it. I do think it works overall, and it is quote unquote a period piece, and so I think a lot of costuming and set choices tend to be pretty grandiose, a big spectacle for movies like this. So in that sense, I think they do a pretty good job. My favorite little production design note, which is also kind of a part of the screenplay, is the imagery of her daughter's drawing where it's like drawn on the fridge and she's scratched it into the bedpost. So I think that's my favorite part by far. Honestly, that's my favorite idea from this movie. Cinematography looks pretty good. There's some pretty flashy trailer shots. I love the shot where it's all of them on the plantation that then pans up to see a plane. I think that's extremely shocking. I wish it had happened earlier, and I just wish the plot served it better because I love that shot. There's also kind of a specific look to this movie of just this really dim lighting, a lot of candle lights, and it's pretty like warm but still dark. So I like that lighting. It's used somewhat commonly in certain haunted house type horror movies, but in this context, I really enjoyed it because it works well on the plantation where it's supposed to feel like it's older times, and there's multiple times where they're in a restaurant or in a store, and the same type of lighting is used, so it actually makes the film feel very, very cohesive. The editing, slow, like I've been saying, and it's also not slow intentionally. It should be a movie that moves much faster. It should be shorter. I also kind of think it should be paced differently. I'm of the opinion that this movie didn't have to be a twist. I think that honestly doesn't serve the story very well. I wish it had started modern day and ended with everything else. I think a linear narrative actually would have worked a lot better for this movie, so the editing kind of fails it in that sense. We move on to the sound. There's typical horror movie sound cues that just don't really work in this context because of the fact that it feels much more like a drama, and it's just sort of like hard to watch in a lot of these scenarios. And the score is like fine, it's serviceable, it works for a horror movie and a drama. It's nothing obviously super insane. I can't pin out a specific track or song that I really enjoyed one over the other. I just think it works in context of the movie. And then as far as the directing goes, it just doesn't really feel like there's a true vision here. It feels like there's like the crumb of an idea that is pretty horrible to think about, and then they realize that they can make it into this big budget horror movie because of the marketing, and overall the film is just fairly weak. And it's not like a lot of these things are like not terrible. It's perfectly fine filmmaking, but I think the cardinal sin of a film honestly isn't bad filmmaking. It's mediocre, boring filmmaking, because if you're going to see a movie, you kind of want to be entertained, even if it's not escapism, even if it's not you trying to forget about certain things or escape into a world for a little bit of time, which is a lot of movies. Even if that's not the case, it should at the very least entertain you or make you think, and I just don't think that this movie does either of those two things. Realistically, this movie should have been a Black Mirror episode. It should have been like an hour-long linear narrative where, or not even a linear narrative, just have the whole thing take place on the plantation, and then you find out that it's modern day without the whole like boring backstory and things like that. So I just think it would have been much better served for like an anthology television show. So that's just my humble opinion. So Antebellum, fairly disappointed by its execution. I think the story should have been a lot more entertaining than it actually was, a lot more horrific. That's not true. A lot more horror-based than it actually was. So I'm going to give Antebellum a soft 4 out of 10. I still would say, honestly, even though I give it a 4 out of 10, I've given movies worse scores and still kind of recommended them. I can't say that I recommend this one. I think it's like, I don't think it's worth your time. I think there's a lot of other more thought-provoking, more entertaining horror movies that are scarier to watch, ultimately. And that's my opinion. That's Antebellum. So, next up, we're going to be talking about my weekly watch, which is called Signs, an M. Night Shyamalan movie, and then my weekly recommendation of the others, and finally stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 movie endings of all time. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review for Antebellum. I'm now going into What? I'm now going to go into my weekly watch of Signs, and then my weekly recommendation of The Others, and then stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 movie endings of all time. So right now, let's talk about Signs. Signs is a movie from 2002, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, hot off the tails of The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and it basically follows a small family in a rural Pennsylvania county that experiences strange phenomena around their farmland that could be related to potential extraterrestrial life or an alien invasion. So this is a movie that I had been highly anticipating for a while, because I know that I have only reviewed one M. Night Shyamalan movie, and it was pretty bad. But I overall kind of like M. Night Shyamalan. I know that he gets a lot of hate for some of the movies that he's done, but I think he has also done some really good stuff, and I think he has a lot of merit. And I hadn't seen Signs, and I had heard that this is a movie that has a pretty cool twist at the end. And so for that reason, I was a little bit disappointed, because I was expecting some big reveal, some big twist that there really isn't any. That being said, it is not a bad movie. I just think that I wanted to give that pretext, because I was expecting that, and so because of that, I was a little bit let down. But having sat with it for a little bit now, this is a movie that definitely has grown on me. I think it is a great, I can say great, maybe it's not my favorite, but I think it's a pretty darn good movie. And just because it doesn't have that signature M. Night Shyamalan twist, it does have some interesting plot reveals at the end of the movie, and I overall think the movie is really, really well made and has some really excellent, motifs and morals to it. So let's talk about Signs. So first of all, this movie most prominently stars Mel Gibson and Joaquin Phoenix. I know, again, that it's difficult to talk about somebody like Mel Gibson in times like this, but I have to say, he had a killer performance. I thought he was fantastic in this movie. He's both commanding and vulnerable, and you get the sense that he's really gone through a lot prior to the events of this movie, and he's just trying his best to create this family dynamic, and he fails a lot of the time, and he's really struggling with this internal battle between faith and grief. And so I think that a lot of that shines through overall in his performance, and his performance progresses really nicely. I don't think I was nearly as invested with him in the beginning of the movie as I was by the middle and the end of the movie, and his character arc makes a lot of sense by the finality of this movie. And then Joaquin Phoenix is also really great. This is a pretty young, or he looks pretty young in this movie, and I know him as a much more recent actor in a lot of other movies, and so seeing him in this kind of a role that's a lot more reserved is a role that I really like from him. My favorite from him is Her, and that's another role that's fairly reserved. This one is a little bit different because it does have this, I would say, sense of discontent even more so than some other roles from him, because he doesn't want to be this reserved, quiet person who's given up on his life in a sense. And honestly, knowing nothing about that in the beginning of the movie, you actually get the sense that he doesn't really feel at home or like himself. He seems like he's kind of uncomfortable in this environment, and that also is made aware through this film. Working with kids also is very, very difficult a lot of times, and I would say that the kids actually offer a pretty compelling performance in this. It's really funny because Rory McCulkin is obviously Macaulay Culkin's brother, and he's around the same age as Macaulay Culkin would have been in Home Alone, and he just is so like Macaulay. It's just, I couldn't help but think about Home Alone in the way that he would say things and the way that he looks. And honestly, at the end of this movie, the movie almost feels kind of Home Alone as they're preparing for some sort of an attack. So I thought that performance was really funny, but I actually felt like this family felt like a family. Like, the kids are able to hold their own in their performance in a way that actually makes the family dynamic work a lot better. And so even though they might be a little melodramatic at times, a little bit over the top at times, I actually think given the scenarios and given the way that the characters interact with each other, it actually works pretty well. And I would say that there was not a point in this movie where I was like, that wasn't great. I don't believe that. Was it my favorite performance from them? No. But were they like 10? Yes. So I can't really blame them for that. So in that sense, I think the performance is pretty great, and I actually think M. Night Shyamalan did a really wonderful job directing the kids. So then we get to the screenplay. I would say that the screenplay is one of the strongest parts of this movie, so even though I might have been disappointed with how it ended, everything comes full circle in a really nice way. As far as like a horror quote-unquote movie goes, it's kind of horror. It's definitely much more sci-fi thriller than it is horror, but that obviously works for the month of October. Because of that, you want a movie that reveals things when necessary, so it definitely hides information in a really creative way through the use of minimal flashbacks and how well they're kind of cut off and how well they're integrated into the actual story. There's also some minor things that are hinted at in the beginning that come back in the end, and so I think in that way, M. Night Shyamalan knows how to write a conclusion. Like, he knows how to bring everything full circle, and that's something that he's really talented at and really shines through in this movie. Also, having it be a psychological thriller, there is a really solid sense of dread in this movie. I'm not gonna say I'm not the biggest fan, but sci-fi horror has never really gotten to me. I just don't find that threat all that terrifying, just because it's not nearly as present in a sense, if that makes any sense. So I've just never been all that interested or engrossed by sort of sci-fi alien type horror movies, but in this one, because the stakes are so intimate and because we are so close with this family, I felt a very looming sense of suspense and danger. And then I think the other final thing about the screenplay that I was really a big fan of is that there's a very strong motif in this of faith. And having a horror movie, I mean, it obviously religion is no stranger to horror movies, but in this context where it's more or less all symbolic and metaphorical, it was a really pleasant surprise that this movie had the amount of emotional and symbolic depth that it ended up having. It also made me appreciate American Horror Story Asylum a bit more, because the aliens are obviously supposed to be sort of like kind of a god metaphor there, so it's also kind of a reference to Signs, but that's besides the point. I'm just a big American Horror Story fan, or I used to be, not anymore. Okay, so now we get on to production design. So this movie takes place in Bucks County, which I think is kind of funny because now that I live in Philadelphia, I know plenty of people from Bucks County, but again, besides the point. So the movie feels very rural, very messy. It feels like a kind of like Midwestern vibe, which is what you'd expect this movie to take place in a place like that. But having it take place on the East Coast makes it a bit more enjoyable for me. I'm a big East Coast fan, and I actually think having that tone and that style for a movie that takes place on the East Coast actually works pretty well in some of the characters' relationships and some of their mannerisms and just how the story progresses in a way. So it's fairly rural. That kind of goes to show in the physical or the exteriors and those environments. And then also, I actually really like the set of the house. You get to know the layout pretty well, and it feels like a house that would exist in this environment. And also, the interiors have this sense of clutter and chaos, and it's just somewhat messy even when it doesn't look overtly really messy. Some things just feel kind of out of place, and so I gotta give props to the set decorators here, set dressers here. And so I actually think that the interior environments look just as discombobulated as the characters probably feel in a lot of ways. Also, it's kind of typical or kind of uninspired in a way, but I actually really like the alien design. It's really effective. It's like, it looks like just the stereotypical idea of an alien, and so for a movie like this that's already kind of silly and also somewhat simplistic, I actually like it. It feels pretty organic, even if the CGI is a little bit wonky. It is 2002, so I give it some, I forgive it there. And we really only see it in its totality once for a long period of time, and you're so invested in the story at that point, and the scene leading up to that is just so intense. And actually, the reveal behind that was my favorite one. That was definitely the best jump scare. And so I actually really like the alien design, and it is pretty effective for when it's used and doesn't feel all that out of place if you don't think about it too much. The cinematography, I just mentioned, there's some really great reveals. So the screenplay does a great job of hiding some information, and so does the cinematography. It is pretty subtle in a lot of ways. It leaves things up to the imagination. It doesn't reveal things too early. So the first few times the aliens are hinted at being there, you don't see them. And then even when you do see one, it's for a pretty short period of time. Then you finally get the big reveal, and that feels a lot more impactful because of the way that they've been hidden in the past. I also just think from a character perspective, a lot of this movie works in close-ups, whether it be mid-shots or just extreme close-ups on people's faces. It makes the camera work and the screenplay and the story just feel a lot more intimate. You feel way more invested in a sci-fi story that feels very surreal, very different, obviously, from our own lives. And so you actually feel like you're a part of the story because the cinematography is so close and so intimate. So then we get into the editing. This movie is also fairly slow, but it is methodical. It is supposed to be about the characters. It's not nearly as much about the story as it is the underlying themes and, like I just mentioned, the characters. So I think that the slow, methodical way of cutting this movie and letting the scenes play out even a bit longer than you might anticipate actually makes this movie flow a lot better. And because of the fact that it's fairly slow, those intense moments feel a lot more impactful. And they also feel a lot more necessary. I don't think you would be able to get through this movie if you didn't have some moments like that. And intense jump scare type moments are way more effective when paired with slower character-based scenes before that. So then the score. My favorite part of the score, or my favorite part of the sound, is the sound design. And not really necessarily like, there's not really creative sounds other than the alien noises, but I think the sound cues and the sound editing sounds really excellent in this because the audio levels work in a way where it doesn't feel totally out of place when something is really loud, but it also is not loud all that often, so it works from a horror thriller perspective. And then, okay, I didn't mention this earlier, but I love the intro to this movie. The score is creepy and intense and really evocative of like the Twilight Zone or sci-fi stories from like the 50s and 60s, and even the like slow, pretty abrasive title cards also work in that way. And so it sets the tone for this movie being pretty socially relevant while still being creepy and science fiction-y. So I love that title sequence. I think it might be top 3 moments of the movie, which maybe is rough because it's so early, but even still. And then finally, the directing. Again, I think M. Night Shyamalan is very competent. I think he knows how to make good movies. I think he just made some poor decisions, and he's much better at movies like this that are really focused on theme and have some. And it doesn't feel gimmicky to have a twist at the end. I always just think those are fun, and as somebody who enjoys movies like that, I gotta say, M. Night Shyamalan is really up there with some of his reveals. And so I think that he's pretty self-aware about that. He knows what he's doing. And in this one, I think he has the right balance of serious thriller aspects and silliness. Like, it's a sci-fi premise. Sci-fi has always been rooted in this sort of goofy, crazy idea that is still supposed to be somewhat thought-provoking, and he really pulls that off in Signs. So I'm going to give Signs a strong 7 out of 10, soft 8 out of 10. I really like this movie. It definitely grew on me. I might have been a little bit disappointed when I first started watching it, or first ended it. I think if I were to watch this again or go into it with different expectations, I probably would have liked it even more. But overall, I can definitely recommend this movie. It is on HBO if you have that, but that is Signs. So next up, I'm going to be talking about my weekly recommendation, a movie I'm very excited to talk about, The Others. And stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 movie endings of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Antebellum and Signs, and I will now be going into my weekly recommendation of The Others. But make sure you stay tuned until that final segment where I talk about my top 5 movie endings of all time. But right now, we're talking about The Others. The Others is a 2001 horror movie directed by Alejandro Amenabar. It stars Nicole Kidman, and it basically follows a woman in early 20th century England, who, after her husband went away to war, is alone in a large estate with her 2 kids who are photosensitive? Synthesensitive? I don't know. They're basically allergic to sunlight. They can't go out in the sun or they will break out and possibly die. So they are alone in this large mansion being haunted by ghosts, and they can't leave because of the sun. So I love this movie. I think this movie is criminally underrated as far as horror movies go. I think like if you are a fan of just creepy, spooky horror movies or horror stories, this is the one for you. It is such a classic like ghost story, and I just feel like that's not done as much anymore. I think there are like reimaginings of the genre, but this is just one that is so reminiscent of classic stories. Like right now, I'm reading The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and I'm also watching the TV show, and I think the TV show does a really great job of integrating modern-day sensibilities with that classic ghost story style. And then the book, obviously, is just a classic ghost story about a haunted house, and this is really no different. And what must be said is that I'm going to talk a little bit about the ending, and the ending changes up the whole thing. So if you have not seen this movie, I highly recommend it. It's also not too scary if you're not a huge horror movie fan. If you want to learn how to like horror movies, be integrated into that, I would also recommend this one for non-horror movie fans because it's just kind of spooky. It has that vibe to it. It's not really all that scary. So if you haven't seen it, click off now, skip ahead, skip to that last segment, because I'm going to talk about the whole movie at large. You done? You gone? Okay, so I'm actually not going to bring it up right away. I'm going to bring it up in a little bit. But I just love The Others, so let's talk about why. First of all, let's start with the acting. It's pretty much just Nicole Kidman. Like, there are obviously other characters, but Nicole Kidman carries this movie, and she has a powerhouse of a performance. She has this element of maturity while still being somewhat unhinged and a little bit like off, and you're not really sure why. And so when she starts to freak out about things and go a little bit mad, which it's also hinted at earlier in the or it's hinted at throughout the movie that something happened prior to the events of this movie that are similar to what's going on now for her. So it doesn't feel out of character when she starts to do those things, and her slow decline makes a lot of sense. Her performance actually breeds this element of de-escalation, or I mean escalation in a sense. So having her in the lead role, I was never a huge Nicole Kidman fan. I'm not gonna say that I like disliked her. I just really hadn't seen her in much. Wasn't my favorite actress, and this is 100% what sold me on her. I think she has a killer performance in this, and it's really make or break with her because it's primarily, other than the kids, it's all about her. And speaking of the kids, what I mentioned in Signs, it's really hard to work with kids. You never know if you're going to get a good performance. And I would say that this performance is even better than Signs. They have this Just it's like if you have kids in a horror movie, it's just creepy right off the bat. And then you get the sense that they're scared of what's going on, and so their like fear is very genuine. I never once thought they're not really scared. It never took me out of the movie, which is pretty easy for a kid's performance to do. It might feel out of place, might feel a little bit wonky, it might just feel a little bit weaker than some of the others. But I have to say, these kids really held their own as far as performances go. And then I also really like the performances by all of the grounds people, because you get a sense of security with them, and then when that's kind of flipped on its head, they kind of have this sense of creepiness to them that wasn't really there before. And part of that is because of the story, but then part of that is because their performances changed just so subtly that makes sense. And then by the end, you get that sense of security again. So I think everybody has a really solid performance in this movie. Then we get to the screenplay. The screenplay, first of all, while still being a classic... Oh, actually, last thing with acting. I want to mention that Chris Eccleston is in this, and he doesn't really do much. I think he serves it, obviously, and he does pretty well. But if you don't know, he's the Ninth Doctor in Doctor Who, and I like Doctor Who, so shout out Chris Eccleston. Okay, screenplay. For being so reminiscent of classic ghost stories and just so inspired by that genre, it is still creative. I love the idea that they basically have to be locked into the house. Because a lot of times there's not an excuse for characters not to leave a house. Like, the house is being haunted, okay, leave. There's obviously certain movies that kind of spin that around where the ghost is actually haunting a person as opposed to a place, or the place actually draws them in or something like that. And sometimes I just feel as though that, not necessarily that that's a cop-out, but it's like, okay, that also is just like, it's unexplained, so you can justify it any way possible. As far as this movie goes, there's actually a real concrete reason that none of them can leave the house, and it's pretty creative. I like the idea that the kids are like kind of allergic to sunlight. That's not something that I've ever really seen in a movie before. It obviously is a real thing. It's fairly rare, but then in terms of this, it makes for the movie to be a lot creepier, and it actually makes the stakes a lot higher too, because not only is the danger supernatural, but the danger is also somewhat physical. And it also is a really great setup for a lot of the events that transpire. So a lot of the things, like I said, so that threat level is also exterior and physical as much as it is interior and mental. And so it has a really solid setup for a lot of the scenarios that happen in the movie. The escalation of the screenplay works really well. It's very slow in the beginning, and you're not really sure what's going on, but everything is kind of like hinted at subtly where the movie might be going. And then as Nicole Kidman's character starts to deteriorate, so does the movie, and it starts to get a bit more intense. It also just starts to get a bit scarier. Like, it just is kind of creepier at the end, and you're on edge for most of it. There's not really a lot of jump scares. There's one or two, but the movie itself is very suspenseful by the time it ends. And then finally, gotta talk about the ending. I love this twist. I'm somebody who saw The Sixth Sense with knowing the twist. I feel like if you were born after 2000, that's probably the case. I feel like very few people don't know the twist of that movie. And so the fact that this twist is somewhat similar, but executed in such a different way, and I actually think serves the story in a very different way, I didn't see it coming at all. I thought it was such a great twist, and it makes the movie that much more enjoyable watching it for a second time, which is something you want from a twist. And I actually think the movie is rewatchable on multiple occasions, not just that second time, because of the amount of subtlety that is implemented into the script. So I can't put it on my list of top 5 movie endings since I talked about it in this episode, but it's up there. It's got to be top 5 movie endings for sure. So then the production design. Obviously, for a movie like this, you want something pretty grand, and that is what you get in the movie. The house, in the same way that the house in Signs, you get a really good idea of what the layout is, and you feel very comfortable there. The exact opposite is the case here. It's so big, it's so vast, and in a way, very unwelcoming, because it's so different than what we're used to nowadays. And because of the fact that it's so open and sometimes just vacant in a way, you always feel a little bit on edge when you're there. You never actually feel at home, which is kind of how the characters feel. And I also like how dull it feels. It doesn't, that's kind of goes into the unwelcoming, just kind of the same camp, but everything, there's no color, there's no pop anywhere. Everything is yellow and brown and white and black. None of it feels homey, which I think makes a lot of sense for a haunted house movie. It's just very Gothic inspired, very Victorian inspired. So in that way, it works for a ghost story. It's excellent. The cinematography, I think my favorite part of the cinematography is the lighting, because of the fact that you have to have a movie that can't use sunlight in a way. Everything is kind of dulled down and softened. It's a lot of soft light throughout this. And then also there's just a lot of dark, dimly lit scenes. So similar to Antebellum, this one has that soft light feel, but it also has the candlelight, low light feel, which is hard to shoot, especially back in 2001. And so it really works. It's also really just creepy. You gotta have some dimly lit lights for that creep factor. It's just so spooky. This is such an October Halloween movie. I love it. Then the editing. This is the third movie I've talked about this episode that's just really pretty slow, but it's excellent. I am a huge fan of movies that move slow if they're methodical. It's really focused on the characters, specifically the kids and Nicole Kidman. So kids, get it? Because her name's Kidman. No, but the stakes and the danger would not feel nearly as intense if we didn't know the characters and if we didn't move along with the characters. So all of those scares feel that much worse because of the fact that we're so intimate with the characters. And a lot of that has to do with these long shots, these long scenes, realistically. And speaking of scenes, I love the scene work in this movie. Every scene feels self-contained, like it could work. It just has its 3 points excellently laid out. I also love the scene, one of my favorite scenes in any horror movie, of since we've already spoiled it, the medium taking the shape of the daughter is just so creepy. Like, because you have no idea what it is. It's like, ugh, and it comes out of nowhere. It's great. I kind of wish it wasn't in the trailer. So then we get to the sound. I like the score a lot in this movie. Again, much like everything else, it's very cohesive. It works for this movie. It's not anything super special. It's pretty soft and simplistic, so it matches the cinematography and the lighting, but it's mainly piano inspired, which is obviously pretty creepy. A lot of it's done in a minor key, which is super important for a movie like this to add to that creep factor. And then everything else is pretty orchestral, pretty early century inspired, so the music fits in here really well. And then finally, the directing. I know very little about this director. This is pretty much the only thing that I've seen from him. He wrote Vanilla Sky, which I haven't seen, but I know is pretty well known. But everything just works so cohesively in this, and I'm just such a sucker for simple movies, and this is that. It's just a ghost story. The directing on actors is super important for a movie like this because it's more or less a character piece, and he does a great job with all of that. So I think the directing is wonderful in this, and so is everything else. I love the others. I can't believe it's not talked about more as far as best horror movies go. So this one I'm going to give a soft 10 out of 10. It's only a soft 10 because it's not my absolute favorite, and it's also not in my top 20, but it is probably in my top 50 because I do really like this movie. I really love this movie. Why did I say like? I love it. Okay, other movies that I love are going to come in the form of a top 5 list, because that is my top 5 movie endings of all time, which is coming up right after this final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Antebellum, Signs, and the others. And because all of those movies have some endings that spin the entire movie on their head, this is going to be my top 5 list of movie endings of all time. So I'm not going to put any of the movies that I just talked about in that list because obviously I just talked about them, but overall these are pretty much also my top 5. The others would probably be in here somewhere, but all the other ones make sense. And I've talked about a lot of them in the past, but I'm going to specifically be talking about the ending. So if you hear a movie that you are interested in and don't want that ending spoiled, I would say skip ahead about 2 minutes because I won't talk about the movies for too long, but I will talk about them for a little bit, and I want to talk about the ending. So if you're interested in any of the movies, I will be kind of spoiling them, so just make sure you are aware of that. But let's get started. Top 5 movie endings. I thought that this list was going to be mostly horror movies, because of the fact that horror movies tend to have some cool twists, but it didn't end up being the case. I will give an honorable mention to Final Destination 5, because it's not on this list, and if you're a fan of that franchise, it has the coolest movie ending of all time. Makes that whole series come full circle, and I just think it's like crazy that they do that. I love the idea of horror movie franchises, and I think a lot of them do that pretty well. And you're getting the sense of that with some more modern day ones with like The Conjuring and Insidious. So if you're a big horror fan, check those out. Final Destination 5. Make sure you watch the whole series before you watch number 5 because the twist doesn't make any sense if you haven't seen those. Okay, on to the real list. Number 5 is kind of a horror movie. If it is considered a horror movie, this is the first horror movie that I ever watched. It's called Cloverfield. I love Cloverfield. I mentioned last week, which was kind of almost all a found footage week, how much I like found footage. I think it's a really great storytelling device, and Cloverfield is no different. This is the first found footage movie I've seen. I guess the first horror movies I ever watched were all found footage, Cloverfield and Blair Witch. But anyway, this is definitely sci-fi. It's more of a sci-fi thriller / monster movie with horror elements. There's a lot of suspense, a little bit of gore, pretty much the only amount of gore you can have for a PG-13 movie, but it is still pretty effective. And the reason that I like this ending so much is because there's this device throughout that's kind of used in VHS. Not really. It's more of a gag in VHS. But in Cloverfield, there's this device that the tape that's being taped over was a day between two of the main characters on Coney Island. And in the beginning of the movie, you don't actually get the sense that they're still together. There's something, might have gone through a breakup or something bad happened. And so it's pretty bittersweet seeing the two moments juxtaposed to each other. And then by the end of the movie, they're the only two characters left. And it's just as bittersweet. But now that they're kind of together again, it's for completely different reasons. And so ending a pretty intense, horrific movie on such a quote-unquote light, happy moment really twists the emotions of the viewer. And so I actually think that makes the ending all that more effective as far as the horror goes. And there's also a little bit of an Easter egg at the very end of something falling in the ocean, which if you know the lore of Cloverfield, which is always fun to look into, I love doing that for movies, it's kind of hinted that is almost what starts the entire chain of events. So I really like Cloverfield. If you haven't seen Cloverfield, and this ending didn't really spoil it for you, so if you haven't seen Cloverfield and are a fan of found footage or a fan of monster movies, I would definitely recommend this one. I think it is super creative, and even though it's pretty well known, I would also say it's pretty underrated. Number 4 is a movie that I've talked about on the podcast before. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's 500 Days of Summer. I just really like this movie ending because it's just so corny. It's so cute. It's so dumb. And for a movie that is already tongue-in-cheek, having it end on a character saying that her name is Autumn and then having JGL take a look at the screen, it's just so goofy. Oh, I love it. The first time I watched it, I think I laughed out loud. I was like, yep, that's exactly the note I want this movie to end on. It's idealistic, it's dumb, and I think it's just so fun. I don't think a lot of romantic movies end on a note that are nearly as memorable as 500 Days of Summer. And it really just ties everything together really nicely too, which is what you want from a movie ending. All right, number 3. This is one that I almost didn't put on the list because it's kind of not an ending, but I just couldn't help it. And it's Avengers Infinity War, because it's kind of not an ending because it's almost a 2-part movie, but it is the ending of this movie. And it's just so effective compared to the rest of the MCU, because everything in the MCU has been like relatively tied up with a bow at the end. It's a big blockbuster movie, so it wants to get as big a mass appeal, so it wants to end things really nicely. And I was pretty convinced that nothing terrible would happen in Infinity War other than some character deaths. And even though we knew that everything was going to come back around in Endgame, having half of the cinematic universe dead canonically for like a year, I don't know, was really heart-wrenching in a way because of the amount of time that we spent with these characters. And I remember one of the reasons I like this ending so much is because I just did not see it coming. And I was like, that final scene with Thanos where he's sitting in the farm where he said that's what he would do, and the score, oh my god. It's not even the score that is the most memorable from those movies, but I can totally pin it in my head. And having Thanos like sit down and smile in my head, I remember going, end it right here. And then it ended. I was like, yes! I was like, they did it. They had the guts to end on something so dramatic and such a big cliffhanger. So I think that is one of my favorites because I'm just such a big fan of the MCU, and having them pull off such a gutsy move realistically. I mean, it paid off really well, and maybe it wasn't as gutsy as I'm giving it credit for, but I just think that compared to the rest of the MCU, it's so different, and it doesn't offer you that sense of closure, and it really makes you anticipate the next one. So I think that ending is one of my favorites. All right, top two are kind of tied. I think they're both pretty similar. Or they're not similar. They're just two of my favorites. That's why they're similar. So, number 2 is an A24 movie called Enemy. It's fairly underrated. I don't think too many people have heard of it unless you're a really big movie fan or a big A24 fan. It stars Jake Gyllenhaal, and it's all about identity and really your perception of yourself and other people. And there's this motif throughout the movie of spiders. I'm not really sure why necessarily. I'm sure if I rewatched it, I could probably figure out a theory. But all of the spiders appear in pretty surreal ways. So the first one is in a dream, and it's a woman with a spider head, which already creepy imagery, really effective. And then there's also a landscape shot of a giant spider walking throughout the city. And you kind of write that one off because it's so out of place, and the spider honestly is pretty distorted. Like, it doesn't really look like a spider, it just looks very unnatural. And so you kind of, like, I don't know, human brains like to make sense of things, so if something makes sense, they kind of get rid of it or amend it in ways. So I was like, oh, maybe it's clouds, or maybe it's smokestacks or whatever. And maybe I'm stupid. Maybe that's not what everybody else thought, but I just didn't really think all that much about it, didn't remember it. And so when the final shot happens, it's such an out-of-place jump scare. It doesn't make any real sense, and it's so surreal. So, and that shot looks fantastic. A lot of that VFX budget had to have gone there. And it just garners such a visceral emotion, and it's so out of place. Oh my god, I love it. It scared the crap out of me. It's such a beautiful shot, and it also makes sense from the character's perspective because the spider kind of recoils in a way where it's scared of Jake Gyllenhaal, and it kind of hammers home how manipulative and how intense Jake Gyllenhaal's character has been throughout the movie, and I just think it looks fantastic. All right, final one. You might have been able to see this coming if you listened to last episode, and I can't talk about the others on this list, but I can talk about the Blair Witch Project. It's the Blair Witch Project. It's my favorite ending, for sure. It's such a good final shot. I can talk about it a little bit more than I did last episode because I can talk about a little bit about spoilers right now. And hopefully, if you listened to that episode and hadn't seen it, you went and checked it out. So, the reason I think this is just so great is because it's so scary, first of all, with having the screams coming from an unnatural place initially because of the fact that the cameras are in different areas and they're showing different things. And then it's just a static shot, realistically, of the character standing in the corner, and you don't get to see their face, and you never get to see the witch, which I was like, when I was first watching it, I was younger, and I was hoping to see the witch, and now I'm so glad I didn't because it's just so much more horrific in your head. And I honestly had to look it up the first time. I didn't know what it came from, and if you remember in the beginning of the movie, there's an older woman getting interviewed about the legend of the Blair Witch, and she mentions that the Blair Witch, if there are multiple kids, she makes one of the victims stand in the corner so she can kill the other one. And so even if you remember that, it takes a minute to recall it. And so then you realize how much danger our main character is in. And I had to look it up. And then I watched it again because it's just such an effective ending. It's so creepy and scary, ties everything together nicely, adds to the lore of everything, leaves things up to the imagination, but gives you just enough answers to scare you. So The Blair Witch Project is my favorite ending of all time. And I gotta say, I'm sure it's up there on other people's lists too, if they're fans of that movie. So that is today's episode. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I love talking about movie endings. I love twist endings. Big fan of The Twilight Zone. So check out some of these movies if you are interested. I want to let you guys know that I will not be putting out an episode this coming Sunday. I will be back next Tuesday, so don't you worry. But as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please remember to subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Also, if you could leave us a nice review, because that always helps us. If you could follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.